means for those that are out in the field working to deliver products and services that may or may not be receive a clean heat credit, both in the future and going backwards to January 1 of 2023, as Ken pointed out earlier today about the need for some clarity, especially for those credits that have already been generated but that have nebulous ownership now. So the straw proposal that staff presented to EAG earlier this week, the equity advisory group, tried to draw some lines, and I appreciate it's a straw proposal. I mean, it's not, they haven't made decisions. They're looking for feedback. And I think there's lots of feedback to provide depending on what you're thinking about. But remember, does the credit start with the person who receives that service or fuel or equipment? Or does the credit go to the entity that is doing the work to install or sell that? Or does the credit go to the entity that is inspiring or otherwise incenting the consumer to order the work and pay for the work? Or does it go somewhere upstream to those that are making it happen downstream? How does that credit get established for each digital product and service? I'm just saying how I think here. I don't want to presuppose any of you have to think this way, but how does that credit ownership get determined based on that product and service? Because I think it has to be different depending on that product or service. And then how does it get transferred? Because if the clean heat standard is truly going to work and going to be different than the traditional EEU, in which a fee is paid and the EEU determines how to do it and they're regulated by the PUC, the credit should be fungible, should be able to be moved from entity to entity depending on need and depending on market forces. So the straw proposal, as I saw it, said when it comes to a delivered, when it comes to equipment installed, that credit is owned by the entity that pays for or otherwise has that equipment installed in their home. So I'll think of a homeowner that gets weatherization, or a cold climate heat pump, or a business that does the same. They have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions. They've reduced presumably their fossil fuel consumption. Thereby, they own that credit. Then how does that credit then move, in my mind, how does that credit move up the supply chain to the obligated party? That question, in my mind, has to be answered. Further, when it comes to an energy product, when that energy product is delivered that reduces greenhouse gas emissions and thereby qualifies for a credit, how is that, who owns that credit? So the straw proposal, and please correct me if I summarize it incorrectly, says if it's a piece of equipment to a home, the homeowner or business owner, the building owner, owns the credit. Okay. And then if it's an energy product that is in our supply, so say we went to 20% renewable liquid fuel or renewable gaseous fuel, and whether you ask for it or not, you get it, but we're doing it as an energy company in order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and our obligation under a clean heat standard, then the company owns the credit. And then the straw proposal says, but for if there's a energy product or service that is specially requested by the consumer, then they own the credit. I'll just say this right now while I have the floor, and then I'll let it go, which is that muddies the waters, in our opinion. That I think if you're going to decide that the homeowner owns the credit when they ask for and pay for a piece of equipment, I understand that. But when it comes to delivering an energy product from a compliance standpoint and from a comprehension standpoint, in our opinion, it doesn't matter whether or not the consumer asked for it or they received it. The energy company invested in it, and they made this transformation in order to reduce their obligation, and then they would own the credit. And then further, how do you establish that chain of custody for that credit? What is the document or the token that, token is just a word. I don't mean an actual token, but what is the thing that moves from homeowner to the installer or to the supplier or eventually to the obligated party? When the obligated party has to show credits in order to lower that check that they're going to write if this becomes law, how do they show it? What is the actual thing that they're showing? Receipts, invoices, spreadsheets, credit compliance form, some sort of contract, all that I think needs to be sorted out, and why I think that this is key. Yes, defining greenhouse gas emissions on different products and services is important, but defining the credit ownership, who owns what and how much, and how it gets transferred up the supply chain to the obligated parties, that is the crux of the clean heat standard as I see it. Now I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Moose?
Hi, I just wanted to comment on, and I understand your viewpoint about, that the obligated party would get the credit, but I'm thinking about people that choose to buy renewable natural gas and pay for it, pay additional, quite a bit for it. And you're saying they don't get the credit for that. And I'm not sure I agree with that, because they are paying a lot of money for that. So that doesn't seem quite right. If it's a blend and that's what the gas company is providing, that's a different story. But if you are intentionally buying renewable natural gas, I'm just saying you're paying a premium for that as a customer.
So that is, in fact, what you said, Luce, is exactly what was identified. I don't want to speak for the department in that Stroud proposal.
Yes, it was. Right. I'm seeing that they will own the credit. And I understand the process is going to take some work. It is going to be complicated. There's no way around it to keep track of who's doing what. That's it. Let someone else talk.
Okay. Rick or Dave?
Well, Dave Westman, and then I'll jump in.
Thanks. I did want to echo that concern about tracking these credits that came up in our review. I mean, it's been an underlying issue that wasn't addressed anywhere in the legislation, and it does appear that it's up to the rulemaking process to create a system of tracking these credits. 100% agree with you, Matt, that it's not at all to me obvious how that is going to get done. And so therefore it has to be part of this rulemaking proceeding. And so, that is sort of part of what our question also resides. I know that different organizations have different positions on how credit ownership should be structured. I'll save my thoughts or comments on that for now, but I do think that tracking these credits, Matt called them a token, whatever, but I think, the legislation says a clean heat credit, and however many credits get established by each project, and then whether or not it gets divvied up amongst parties according to either bilateral or multilateral agreements, there needs to be an ability to basically it can't just be one token, right? It's got to be something that can be divided, right? And so it cannot be a simple, integer value. It needs to therefore be splittable and trackable over time. And then the last thing that I wanted to flag in this idea or issue that we see as important is that it needs to be immutable, in that a customer who, let's say they receive full credit, and then gives it through a bilateral contract in exchange for an incentive or a payment to a third party, they can't then go out and sell it again to another third party. It needs to essentially exchange hands and no longer be available to that customer after a bilateral or multilateral arrangement is reached. All of that is very complex. The closest analogy that we can think of is a renewable energy credit. There are other states that are implementing thermal renewable energy credits, and there needs to be a pretty significant, I think, process for creating that tracking mechanism.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, thanks.
The other one, and I know Justin's on the line, but the other is the renewable identification numbers that the federal government puts out for downstream sales of biofuels. I don't know if that's a model that we could possibly think about, but
yeah, good point. Let me just I'll make my comment and then hand over to Dominic. A couple things, Matt. On this question of incremental activity by the, say, the homeowner or the business owner. That's going to be, I think, a nut that we have to crack. I'm wondering, it seems to me that in the longer term, that question will be resolved contractually. That, providers and, purchasers will, make their deals. This, hey, I'm going to put in something, I'm going to buy more of your renewable gas or your renewable oil product than you've got in your mix. That has value. There's certainly value associated with that, and you and I will, affect I think, a contract on that. And I would imagine, and this is just, just the way I see it as a practical matter, that it'll be in that very act that the movement of the credit will go from me, the homeowner or business owner, to the supplier. But I do expect, as Lou says, that there'll be claims on that incremental discretionary purchase by homeowners and business owners. I want to throw into the mix here another complication, and that is that I think we're going to find a difference. And I think, Matt, you've talked about this before. I know Ken has. There'll be a difference between how we treat what I'm referring to as the early action credits, the things that have been happening since last year, and how we treat and how the credits and actions are treated after the rule goes into effect, and obligated parties are out there trying to meet their obligations with the rule in place. So that's something perhaps to keep in mind. I'll put my hand down. Dominic.
Yes, appreciate this discussion, and also as one of the people who helped draft the staff proposal, happy to answer any clarifying questions. I did actually have a clarifying question for Luce. You made the comment that you agreed with the approach of giving the credit to the customer who has chosen a higher or I guess a lower carbon intensity, higher biofuel blend. And you mentioned both price and choice. I'm curious if one of those two aspects weighs more heavily in your head in supporting that position. Is it that they've paid more, or that they have made the choice to request it?
They've made the choice to offset their greenhouse gas emissions, excuse me, by purchasing renewable natural gas.
Great, I appreciate that clarification.
Justin, before I turn to you, let me ask you this question. Are you a member of the public, or are you with an organization sitting in?
So I'm here as a member of the public, although I also represent one of the largest fuel distributors in the state, and have a couple other clients not in Vermont, but who are actively involved in various carbon markets, in particular around the world. And so I think my comments, at least,
before you comment, in keeping with the protocols we've discussed earlier, I would put it to the breakout group, the tag members in the breakout group, for their decision about how much public comment we want to take at this point in our discussion. We can save it to the end of our time here, or refer it to the public comment in front of the entire tag. I'll just say I'm open to public involvement here, but I do want to keep it limited. This is the tags meeting. Okay, so we've got things to deal with. But if the group feels that comment from others on the phone right now would be desirable, I certainly don't want to get in the way of that. So
my preference is that we hear from the tag members first, but we absolutely make time for the public who are attending these meetings to offer their wishes, understanding that we have a hard out in 15 minutes, 18 minutes about.
So why don't we then, Matt, when it gets to be you know, say 5 p.m, we'll reserve some time then. Does that make sense?
So in the draft proposal or my summary of the of the questions that I think need to be answered by the tag or by the PUC, what have I missed or what should be emphasized? Do members of the tag have any particular thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, Matt, I missed it. Are you referring to the 4
Yeah.
questions at the end of
No,
this?
yeah, I'm referring to the straw proposal on credit
Yeah.
ownership. Because I think that's a good starting point, whether you agree with that wholeheartedly or not, or disagree with parts of it. I think it would be helpful for this body to inform the tag of our thoughts on whether or not what should be changed in the straw proposal going forward.
Right.
I voiced opinion about deliverable fuels. Luce had a slightly different version of that, and that's fine. Is there any other things that you want to distinguish or set aside or emphasize within that straw proposal?
Well, before we go to Dave, I would just say the question that you've raised and Luce as well, that would be covered under the second question in my view here. Do you agree?
The second question on our assignment here?
On this, in the straw proposal, yeah. In other words, what I thought you were asking is, are these 4 questions a good, point of departure for our work? I think the answer is
Oh.
yes.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes.
And I think the answer is yes. And I think the issue that you've raised gets taken up at least under the second of the 4 questions.
Oh, okay.
That was my, so I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Dave?
Thanks, Rick. And I should note for everyone else participating that I'm representing Efficiency Vermont as a tag member in this breakout room, so not as a member of the public. So that recognizing that Emily Roscoe is our delegated tag representative. So I just wanted to make that clear to everyone. I should have said that in my first comments. But yeah, I tend to agree with you, Rick. I think the questions the commission identified here sort of address. I believe that most of our issues could probably get addressed there, although I don't exactly see a place to address this trackability comment that I raised. And so if I was going to add a question, I would probably add that one. But I do have comments for the credit being awarded to customers, but I'll save those until we get to it.
Okay.
Matt, is it best that we all respond to this straw proposal in writing to you, and then you can summarize our comments for the next meeting? Would that
Boy,
be a,
that would be very helpful. That'd be
because I
very
think
helpful.
that would be good.
particularly highlighting areas of emphasis or agreement and areas of disagreement, rather than having someone write an entire straw proposal. I think that would be helpful, or a counter straw proposal.
And as I think of this too, I'd like to think of examples, and maybe we can talk about that in our next breakout session. Like, let's give some concrete examples. I've got a good one. I just put in a wood pellet stove last week, the new efficient model. So I got a rebate for that. Is that also going to generate more credits? And it's, how's that all going to work?
Right.
From whom did you get the rebate?
I think, it was prescriptive, I believe. I think some came from Efficiency Vermont. I think some came from the dealer, or, I believe it was prescriptive.
Well, I can imagine those folks are going to lay claim to the action then, or at least to some part of it. That'll be interesting. Okay. Dave.
Oh, I'm sorry. My hand should have been lowered.
So Matt, you like that idea of us, breakout group members, and maybe you want to invite the rest of the tag also to offer you thoughts if they wish.
Yeah,
before our next meeting.
and it's hard to track, again, with all the pieces of paper going back, who's read the straw proposal. But I certainly would encourage every member of the tag to read it, and I'd be happy to aggregate comments for that.
And I will be glad to help you if that would, if you need it.
Great. Okay, anyone
So
else on
that's-
the tag want to offer a comment before I open it up for the public? I'm hearing from Dave, I just want to make sure I have this right. It's not just about tracking the credit. It's about ensuring that what is the words you used? It was,
Immutability.
yeah, what's a sixth grade version of that word?
No double counting.
No,
Thanks, Rick. That's exactly what it means.
Yeah.
That's a sensitive topic because for a lot of reasons, but yes.
but it's more than that. It's no double counting, but it's also splitting of that credit, the divisibility
That was
of the credit.
Yes.
that was further iteration of what we're saying as well. Yeah.
So it's establishing who owns the credit, how it's transferred, making sure that's not count twice or three times, and in where it's appropriate, and to be determined where it is divided.
Exactly.
To Dave's point, the administration of this clean heat standard is going to be a lot, right? It is just going to be a lot.
Yep.
To keep track of.
Absolutely. Tracy Myers of the PUC.
Hi, so sorry, I had a hard time unmuting. Tracy with the PUC. At this point, we're really trying to get some movement on initial credit ownership. So maybe some feedback from the group on the tracking issue. I know that's going to be much more related to process. And no matter who gets ownership first, we know there's going to be splitting, sharing, hoarding, retiring, all kinds of things are going to happen with the credits. So my question is, do we feel like tracking is really pertinent to the initial ownership question? And maybe it is. Maybe giving it to customers really complicates things and it should go another direction. Or maybe tracking is more of a process question that we will get to in the future so that we can focus on initial ownership first. So just some feedback on that.
Could I just react to that, which is, I think tracking is part of that retirement or the minting of the credit. Watching it go through the iterations, I agree, Tracy, that's not necessarily, but it is important to ensure that it is not counted twice and that there is some sort of record of it being retired. So it needs to be minted and then retired and not double counted, but allowed to be divisible in certain situations. So tracking, you're right. Tracking is not really the goal, but it's part. I think it's part of how we figure out how to make sure all the other things go right. Dave, do I have that right?
100% right.
All
I
right.
agree. It needs to all be addressed all at the same time.
Right. Okay. Other tag members, any thoughts before we open to the public? And Matt, you're the leader here. I've been sort of taking the.
Oh, that's all right. No, I think we got 10 minutes. I'd love to hear from someone that's not on the tag. If there's no other tag comments to offer what they have, you go ahead and raise your hand, or if you're on the phone, you can just.
Well, here, what we'll do is let me just start with we're going to go to Ben Pulaski first, and then we'll go to Thomas Weiss, and then Greg Morse. Go ahead, Ben.
So yeah, Ben Welski speaking on behalf of TJ Poor as a member of the tag. I just wanted to throw out there a couple things that the Equity Advisory Group came up with in our assessment of the straw proposal. We came at it really from, of course, an equity lens, but came up with the thought that, there should be some initial ownership by the customer in all cases, just from basically the view of sort of a consumer protection. Basically, we just thought that folks should be aware that there is this transaction of clean heat credits taking place before being delivered to fuel, and being unaware of any transaction taking place. We just thought that was important for folks to know up front, so that they're aware that there's the clean heat credit exists in the transaction. We thought that was an important part of it. So kind of to that end, we thought that the initial ownership should lie with the customer. Even if it's only a 10-second transfer, signature over to that obligated party, but essentially disclosure, a signature of some sort would be required from the deliverer. That's what we came up with sort of from an equity perspective. But if folks have another way that we think we could address the equity portion of that ownership question, and ensuring that consumers have all their, are aware, then I think we're open to that. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks, Ben. Mr. Weiss, then Greg Morris, then Justin Johnson.
Hello, this is Thomas Weiss. Thank you for taking my comments. I've got a few comments. The first on the tracking system, I'd like to remind the TAG that Act 18 and the December schedule called for some discussion on a credit tracking system to register, sell, transfer, and trade credits to obligated parties. I'm not saying don't take it up now. I'm just saying that it was envisioned at as part of the process down the road somewhere. Secondly, on initial ownership, I burn biodiesel, 100% biodiesel. I've been burning for heating, and I've been burning it for probably 10 years or more. And I started out with various lower blends, mixing it into my oil tank. And my point is that I don't think it is appropriate for my fuel dealer or for me to claim to get a credit for my continuing use of biodiesel because it was a pre-existing use. And continuing to sell me biodiesel doesn't actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions now that the program has started. And in thinking about this, I also realized that it affects the pacing decisions as well, which is why I had thought, I'd like to be in three units, but this is where I am, this credit ownership part. But so the question is how to handle pre-existing users, and it would work. The question would also apply to renewable natural gas. If they've been buying it pre-clean heat standard, pre-2023, then should a credit be awarded for that at all? So those are my comments.
Thank you. Thank you. Greg Morse.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for giving me a few minutes. Just to respond to Thomas, I had always...
Excuse me, Greg Morris for everybody is with VGS.
Vermont Gas. That's right. I have that my name there, but and I have my vest on, so everyone can see that. if you can see it on my camera. I think the pre-existing use thing seems like it's built into me, right? Because your obligation for a future year is based on what you emitted. So if you are already reducing your emissions because you're selling some biofuels, that would change what your obligation is in the future. So I would just encourage you guys to think that through all the way. I don't know if I have the answer, but there's a feedback loop built into the law there. I also think it's important that we remember why obligated parties are obligated in the first place, right? Obligated parties aren't actually burning the fuel for the most part. So to the extent that an obligated party does something that creates a credit, like deliver biofuels, and that credit ends up in the ownership of the customer and not the obligated party, then the obligated party still has to go out and replace that credit. So there's the possibility that we're actually raising the cost of fuel by requiring the credits to end up in the hands of a customer when it really isn't necessarily a customer who's interacting or making the decision to have that fuel delivered or something like that. And then the last point I want to make is around voluntary use. So I totally agree that voluntary customers should get credit for their choices. And we made some comments to this effect in earlier PUC proceedings around credit ownership. But you have to remember that that there are commercial realities behind making those programs available. And VGS is probably the only entity that runs a regulated voluntary program. So if a customer wants to go out and find the biofuel and ship the biofuel and contract for the biofuel by themselves, by all means, take all the credit. But if your provider has to help you do that to facilitate this market working, then we've got to think about a way that facilitation adds value, or you probably won't get that facilitation taking place. And the voluntary side has the potential to just sort of flatline and collapse. So one more thing I think that we should think about as these rules get built. Thanks for your time.
Greg, that sounds like, thank you. That sounds like a splitting issue perhaps, but yeah, thank you. Let's see. Justin Johnson. And if you don't have it, don't forget to drop your hand if you don't have any more comments.
Yeah, so I know we're short on time, so I appreciate getting a minute or two here. My comments, I'm just going to say 3 really basic things, but this comes from my experience working with the International Emissions Trading Association, which works on the design of both compliance and voluntary carbon markets, mainly around the world. I think the first thing to keep in mind is the value of these credits is all with the obligated party. They're ultimately the one who has to have the credits, and whether it's a credit they created through a transaction or something they can get somewhere else, the value is going to be tied to their cost of obligation, and in this case, to the cost of a designated delivery agent credit, which is going to set the market for all of these things. So I think it's just important to remember that the obligated party is ultimately the only person who needs these credits. And so they're the ones who are going to sort of set the price. The second thing I just say is from the outset, you should treat the credits like financial instrument. If you want to see what happens if you don't, look at the beginnings of the European emission trading system 10, 12 years ago. It was a disaster. They're a financial instrument. They're basically the same as money, so you need to track them like that. There should be a single registry for credits, and they should all have unique identifiers. There's markets all over the world that do this every day. They do it with allowances that are issued by governments. They do it with offset credits, which are created by organizations doing work all over the place. So it's not hard to do, but you need to do it. Single registry. And then the final thing I'd say is there should be an annual independent review of market activity. It seems like overkill on day one, but it is really important to understand what is happening in the credit market to make sure that it's been operated above board and can last for the long term. That's it for the moment. So thanks.
Well, thanks. Let's see, Dominic, and then back to you, Matt, because you really are the leader here.
I had a clarifying question for Mr. Johnson. You mentioned the single registry with unique identifiers. I'm curious if you have any understanding of how, if those credits are divisible, and if so, how that is managed through a unique identifier tracking system.
Yeah, so that is a challenge, I think, because for most credits in most programs in the world that are related to reducing carbon, a credit is 1 ton of carbon. So they don't get divided. But there are options for, like, if you use a number and you can then break the number down. So I think that it's not that hard to do. It just has to be a number sort of bigger than 1, as it were, that you can then break down. It just needs to be consistent from day one.
So long as it's not pi, we're okay, right?
Well, yes.
Matt, back to you.
Any other comments from the members of the public before we just wrap up? Okay, so I think we're asking the right questions. Number 1, we're asking everyone on the tag to read the straw proposal and offer points of emphasis or offer areas of disagreement or agreement. We know we need to resolve who owns the credit, depending on the energy product, equipment, or service, how it's minted, how it's transferred, how it can be retired by an obligated party. We want to make sure there's no double counting, but there is interest in a token or a credit that is divisible, depending on who is. And there are questions from the public. Thomas Weiss offered about what is the baseline, and do you get credit above what you're already doing? Okay, that's it.
So, yeah, let me, if I may, so,
Sure.
so our charge then is that we, will, you'll collate, reactions from the tag, and we'll end up digging into these issues in our next breakout.
Yep.
Which it sounds like we ought to have during our next meeting.
That sounds
Does
right.
that sound right? Does that sound right? We'll do obviously offline, Emily and I and the breakout leaders will do some thinking about organizing all this, but that sounds like we've got a little bit of a plan here. That's good. Thank you, Matt, very much. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it.
Last
Dave?
one, Dave?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Mr. Johnson for those comments. They're actually really kind of consistent with how I've been thinking about the scale of our projects as well, because the mention of a 1 ton of carbon being the sort of like universal value of a carbon market, that's too large for us, right? And so I think that when we're talking about heat pumps or biofuel deliveries to individual households that are potentially going to customers, I think that could be a really good question to sort of talk about it in the context of that trading, and what is that right value for the scale of the Vermont clean heat projects that we're talking about. And maybe that's 1 kilogram or 1 pound, however the state wants to track it.
It could be that we look at houses or residential differently than businesses, hospitals, schools, that's another thing to think about.
Thank you, Luz.
I think
Okay,
we're
the breakout room
leaving
is
in
gonna
29
close.
seconds.
29 seconds. I'm gonna stop recording and we'll see you in the main room.
Okay.